cite the tertiary institutions that offer training in, again, different areas of journalism. And then ad hoc training opportunities organized by various agencies that often provide opportunity to sharpen the skills of journalists across the country. Media Council, for example, has done quite a bit of work in this area, and the Kenya Editors Guild also engages quite a bit in providing opportunity for journalists to be able to sharpen their skills. Journalism training should have three components. The first area is for the skill or the craft of journalism itself. The second part is focus on the knowledge of the field of journalism. And then the third component, in my view, is content field. What stories do journalists tell? What area of concentration does that come from? The skills of the craft part is obvious. This is where journalism trainings are exposed to coursework on news reporting, news writing, features writing, writing opinions, editorials, magazines. Madam Omungu has done a pretty good job at capturing as part of these areas that journalists get trained in. The second part features training in knowledge field of the area. So, for example, what are the ethical issues that a journalist not be paying attention to? What are the legal issues that we need to be focusing on? And so to speak, how street smart can you be in order to cover the bits that you may be assigned appropriately? The third area is content. This would vary from journalist to journalist. I think in the first two areas, we pretty much say every journalist needs to have some skills in those places. So, for example, any cab reporter obviously must have the skills in the first area. But then as you rise into the space, then the necessity to be able to be skilled editor comes in. But that part, which is the more specified area, is a question of what stories do we tell as journalists? What exactly are you an expert in? The field from which you draw from, that when you begin to tell the stories in that particular space, you will be so engaged with every aspect of it that it becomes easy to tell the story of that area very well. This would form, for example, such fields as politics, business, parliament, climate, courts, religion, and could go on. And again, Rosalia exposed, discussed quite a bit of that area. Even in sports, we have specific content areas, for example, football, motorsport, swimming, athletics. Again, not every sports journalist can cover everything in sports, but the necessity to acquire skill sets in some specific area that will make you an expert in that. Today in Kenya, some of these content areas have no specialized reporters, despite the importance of those fields. And I often tell people, take for example, we all go to church, we all go to mosques, we all go to places of worship. But do we really have reporters in Kenya today that have clear command of this place of religion in society and how that affects the kind of things that we do? If you take religion, for example, into detail, it's quite a flashpoint in our society. It would be impossible, for example, to report the Middle East without an appropriate appreciation of the oldest religions, Islam, Christianity, and Judaism. And there are points of convergence and there are points of departure. In the Arab world today, the divide between Shia and Sunni Muslims sometimes is at the heart of the story. Not all Christian priests are fathers. Indeed, some Christian churches don't even have priests. Instead, they have pastors and different names. If we do not appreciate that detail, it would be very difficult to cover that field with sufficient expertise. Now, I'm just using the field of religion as an example. If we do not understand, for example, the difference between Akorino and the PAG, and why when Akorino does the things they do, what is it that is at the heart of what they're doing, it would be possible to report that area with specificity. specificity and with the details that it requires. Most of the training offered in this country actually focuses just in the skills area, news reporting, news writing. Then later on develops into the later details of editing and other aspects, but there are. The kind of trainings that we tend to have are too often focused on training editors or right journalists on the same things that we tend to have focused attention on previously. And too often drawn from, I think the new word in the space is veteran journalist, where veteran journalists come to train the younger journalists, for example, election reporting, among other things. There are at least 3 parts to the newsroom. One is through formal training. I mean, you go through the specific institutions and then of late go through the media council to get the internship in the media houses and then be able to make your way into the newsroom. The second is the natural storyteller who, because of their skills in storytelling, essentially emerge and become newsroom personalities. I don't exactly know what media personality is, but from that they become personalities in that space. The third part is much more murky. Maybe somebody who has been a good DJ or a socialite performer eventually emerges to join the newsroom and finally find themselves telling the stories. So the training tend to focus on a lot of these areas. Not all good storytellers have to be trained. There are some good storytellers that are good to go in terms of their storytelling. And UNESCO has recognized this, and particularly looking at it from the point of view of the right to freedom of speech, right to expression, say the requirement that journalists be accredited violates that space. And so they argue that anybody who has a microphone should have the right to say what they need to say. But I think some of the adult trainings are usually targeted at helping people to be able to hone their skills and then a bit of the terrain that involves in reporting in this area. The area that China is most lacking is content. What's the story that a journalist is going to tell? It is the energy, if it is the energy story, to what extent does the journalist understand that field so exhaustively that they can actually tell that story effectively? It's not just a question of seeing lights. How many, when you're buying your bulb, what does that really mean with regard to the consumption of energy in the specific area? How many journalists understand that? Finance, agriculture, or say, for example, infrastructure. The centrality of climate today cannot be overstated. Why things are happening the way that they are doing. Too often we reflect back that those who have tended to emerge as climate champions and climate reporters in the country are, and other things as well, is driven by the fact that they develop a liking for that space, or they see a gap and they develop a liking for that space. But how can their capacity, the command of just liking as opposed to early exposure and continued exposure to latest developments in that field is really critical. And climate is one of those spaces. It's playing havoc with farmers and it's at the heart of the survival of communities. This is what makes this initiative that we're talking about really important. That in my view, I'm not so much looking at it as focusing attention on the first 2 areas of journalistic training, but essentially on the third, which is the content. What is the story that we're going to tell? And again, if I draw from what Rosalia has just been talking about, the various aspects of climate that we can be able to report and write about in our areas. If possible, skills for telling the climate story is so important. As journalism curriculum designers and trainers, we look forward to the challenge of ensuring that more journalists have the knowledge of this area, so that when we get together, when they get to tell the story, that they'll actually be telling this story with the necessary expertise that is required in that space. And I think what that does require to a great extent is how can we be able to not just introduce journalists to the experts in the field that will continuously develop, improve, input more into the understanding of what's happening, how the field is evolving, but to be able to create a channel through which such climate stories and related content can continuously be covered. It's one thing, for example, to be passionate about climate, but then you go to the newsroom to an editor who is completely untouched by what you're talking about. Let me tell a story here which speaks to sometimes the necessity to understand the story out there, but then probably having an editor that is not connected. We all know about Roger Whittaker. Who was he? Was he just a musician? Not like, I also sing. A musician born in Kenya, lived in, and really rose to be a great musician. Where was he living when he lived in Kenya? Does anybody remember? Waithaka? Anyway, the story goes that one time, I think it must have been the story of Roger Whittaker or somebody like that, a serious musician that had Kenyan roots that passed on, if I'm not wrong. And then a music journalist came to the newsroom very shocked that such a serious musician has passed on and wanted to write the story. But the editor never liked music, never enjoyed music, and so had no idea what music was all about. So when the news reporter comes in and says, we have got a breaking story, this top musician has passed on. And the editor asks, what do you mean top musician? They say, he sang the stories about Kenya, and etc. etc. So is he like Kimanu or something? And it now became the task of the reporter to start helping the editor understand the magnitude, the importance of the journalist, of the musician that had passed on. And because of the chain of news processing, if the editor does not appreciate the magnitude of a story, it will be very difficult for the reporter to be able to carry the story through to its appearing on the screen, on the print pages. And so the ability to develop this entire chain so that you do not come to the editor with all your training in the field of climate change, and the editor begins to wonder, what do you mean by this climate change? You mean this climate is changing? But the necessity then to be able to appreciate across the chain of the reporting. And so what one will be looking forward to from the engagement that we're having today is that it's not just the question of providing the climate of appreciation of the changes that are taking place in our environment, but we're providing a chain and a realization, a sensitization within the newsroom that these are important stories because of their impact on society generally. So that when a story is breaking of this nature, that the journalists, that the editors will be sufficiently engaged to assign the appropriate reporter, but to provide enough space for that story may be carried out, maybe featured in the subsequent editions, the bulletins, etc., etc. And so the task here, the way I see it, is that we must not just start by creating a cadre of individuals who appreciate the environment, who appreciate climate, who appreciate what's going on in the space, but to seek to create a change also in the newsroom, desks that will constantly be looking out and creating calls for climate-related stories so that this becomes a constant story that we're going to be engaged in. But we don't want to see the editors, the reporters that are going to be engaged in this space, not just focus their attention on the local market. Too often, reporters, and I spend most of my time in the training, and they look up to a couple of stars that show up on the television screens or on the pages of the newspapers, and they say, that's my role model. But we're looking at a situation where your focus is telling the story, and we should then be able to tell this story wherever stories can be told. And in the kind of worlds that we're now occupying, there are a range of platforms that are becoming available for us to tell the stories. It's not just KBC, it's not just NTV, Citizen, etc. It's not just NTV, I mean the Daily Nation and the Star and all the newspapers that we have. But the platforms of telling stories are now increasingly on our hands. And so to what extent would individuals whose skill sets have been developed and whose understanding and knowledge of the climate theme have been enhanced will then deploy in telling the stories beyond the traditional platforms, but also look at the international market where stories can be featured. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Prof, let's clap again for Prof.